The telegram arrived at 7 in the morning, and I knew before I opened it that something had shifted. It was 1953, and in those days a telegram before breakfast meant one of two things. Either someone had died, or someone was about to ask you to do something you would regret. The paper was thin in my hands. The Veterans Relief Committee of Los Angeles respectfully requested my presence at their annual benefit dinner. They wanted me to speak. They wanted me to say a few words about patriotism, about service, about the American spirit. I set the telegram down on the kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. You have to understand what that word meant back then. Patriotism. It had become a weapon, a club that certain men in Washington swung at anyone who dared to think differently, to question, to stand up for a colleague who had been named without evidence. I had signed a letter 6 years earlier, along with other people in my industry, protesting the way the House Committee was conducting its investigations. That letter had not been forgotten. My name was on a list somewhere. I was being watched, and now they wanted me to speak about patriotism at a dinner for veterans. The irony was not lost on me. I could have declined. I could have sent a polite note explaining that my schedule was full, that I had commitments in another city, that I was deeply honored, but unfortunately unable to attend. No one would have blamed me. Half the people I knew in Hollywood were keeping their heads down, saying nothing, waiting for the storm to pass. The smart move was silence. The safe move was invisibility. But I kept thinking about the men who would be in that room. Men who had crossed oceans and walked through fire. Men who had lost limbs, lost friends, lost parts of themselves that would never grow back. Men who had done the hardest thing a person can do, which is to put their body between danger and the people they loved. Those men deserved better than a speech full of empty words and careful evasions. I sent my acceptance that afternoon. The dinner was held at a hotel ballroom downtown. The kind of place with chandeliers and white tablecloths and waiters who moved like ghosts between the tables. I arrived early, as I always did. There is something about being the first person in a room that settles the nerves. You can watch the space fill up. You can read the faces as they enter. The veterans came in slowly, some of them on crutches, some of them in wheelchairs, some of them walking with that particular stiffness that comes from wounds you cannot see. Their wives held their arms. Their children looked around with wide eyes at the fancy room. The silver flatware, the flowers on every table. These were not wealthy people. These were working people who had been given a night of recognition, a few hours of being told that their sacrifice had mattered. I watched an older man in the corner, his suit too large for his frame now, his medals pinned carefully to his chest. He was talking to a younger man, maybe his son, and I could see from across the room that he was trying to explain something. His hands moved in the air, shaping a memory. The younger man nodded, but his eyes were elsewhere. He did not understand. How could he? You cannot explain war to someone who has not been in one. You can only carry it, quietly, for the rest of your life. The organizers found me near the entrance and ushered me to a table at the front. A man named Harrington, chairman of the committee, shook my hand with both of his and told me how grateful they were that I had come. His grip was firm, his smile wide, but there was something careful in his eyes. He leaned close and spoke quietly. "We're honored to have you, Mr. Peck. The men are thrilled, just thrilled." He paused, glancing toward the back of the room where two men in dark suits stood watching the crowd. "I'm sure you'll keep it uplifting. These boys have been through enough. They don't need anything complicated tonight." I understood what he was telling me. Keep it simple. Keep it safe. Don't say anything that might make anyone uncomfortable. Don't mention the hearings, the accusations, the friends who had lost their jobs because someone had whispered a name into the wrong ear. Just talk about flags and freedom and the American way. I nodded and told him I would do my best. The dinner proceeded as these things always do. There were introductions and acknowledgments, awards presented to men who had distinguished themselves in service, applause that rose and fell like waves against a shore. I ate without tasting anything. I reviewed the notes I had written on a small card in my pocket, the safe remarks I had prepared, the careful words that would offend no one and challenge nothing. A woman at the next table was crying softly. Her husband, a man with burn scars covering half his face, held her hand and whispered something I could not hear. She nodded and wiped her eyes. They had been through something together that the rest of us could only imagine. And here they were, dressed in their best clothes, hoping that tonight might offer some small comfort, some acknowledgement that it had not all been for nothing. And then my name was called, and I walked to the podium, and I looked out at that room full of faces. The veterans were watching me. Their eyes were steady, patient, the eyes of men who had learned to wait. Their wives sat beside them, hands folded, hoping for something that would make this evening worth the trouble of getting dressed up, worth the aching joints and the long drive. The children were restless, as children always are, ready for the speeches to end, so they could go home. I placed my prepared remarks on the podium. I looked at them for a long moment, and then I set them aside. I was asked to speak tonight about patriotism, I said, about what it means to love this country. And I've been thinking about that question for weeks now. What does it mean? What does it really mean to be loyal to America? The room was quiet. Harrington, at his table near the front, had stopped smiling. I've played a lot of different men in my work. Soldiers and lawyers, doctors and cowboys, men of courage, and men of doubt. But I've never played a character more difficult than the one I'm being asked to play right now. The character of a man who looks at his country, sees something wrong, and says nothing. A murmur moved through the room. I could feel the temperature changing. The two men, in dark suits near the back, had straightened in their chairs. You men in this room tonight, you know what it means to serve. You know what it means to put yourself in harm's way for something larger than yourself. You didn't ask for guarantees. You didn't ask for safety. You went because your country called, and you trusted that the country you were fighting for was worth the sacrifice. I paused. The older veteran in the corner was watching me now, his hands still on the table, his eyes sharp and unblinking. But here is what I believe. Loyalty is not silence. Patriotism is not obedience. The men who wrote our Constitution understood that the greatest threat to a free nation is not the enemy outside its borders. It is the fear that grows within. Fear that makes neighbors suspicious of neighbors. Fear that turns accusation into conviction without the burden of proof. Fear that asks good people to look away when injustice is done, because speaking up might cost them everything. Harrington was leaning forward in his chair. His face had gone pale. The woman who had been crying earlier was watching me with something that looked almost like hope. I know there are people in this country right now who have lost their jobs, lost their reputations, lost their ability to provide for their families, not because they did anything wrong, but because someone decided to name them. Not because there was evidence, but because there was suspicion. And I know that many of us have been told that the patriotic thing to do is to stay quiet, to let the investigators do their work, to trust that the men in charge know what they're doing. I look directly at the veterans now, at their steady, waiting faces, at the medals on their chests, and the scars on their bodies, and the memories behind their eyes. But you men didn't fight so that Americans could be afraid to speak their minds. You didn't bleed on foreign soil so that citizens could be destroyed by whispers and innuendo. You fought for something better than that. You fought for the idea that a person is innocent until proven guilty, that every American has the right to face their accuser, that we do not abandon our principles when they become inconvenient. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the children had stopped fidgeting. I cannot tell you what to believe. I cannot tell you how to feel about the events of these past few years. But I can tell you this. The best way to honor the sacrifice of the men and women who have served this country is not to wrap ourselves in the flag and pretend that everything is fine. The best way to honor them is to be worthy of what they fought for, to defend the freedoms they defended, to have the courage they had. I picked up my prepared remarks and folded them once. We can best fight those who would destroy our way of life, not by becoming like them, but by being better, by practicing the democracy we preach, by refusing to let fear make us smaller than we are. I stepped back from the podium. Thank you for allowing me to be here tonight. And thank you for your service. All of you. The room was silent for what felt like a very long time. I could hear my own heartbeat. I could feel the weight of every eye in that room pressing against me. And then, the older veteran in the corner began to clap. Slowly, deliberately, his weathered hands coming together with a sound like distant thunder. His son looked at him, surprised, and then joined in. A woman at another table stood up, still clapping. Then another. Then another. Not everyone applauded. Harrington sat frozen in his chair, his hands motionless on the table. Several men near the back exchanged glances and did not move. The two men in dark suits wrote something in small notebooks and slipped out through a side door. But enough people were standing now that the room had shifted, and I understood that something had happened that could not be undone. Afterward, as people filed out into the cool night air, the older veteran made his way toward me. He walked slowly, his cane tapping against the floor, his medals glinting under the lights. When he reached me, he did not offer his hand. He simply looked at me with those steady eyes and nodded once. "My boy came back from Italy in '44, he said quietly. He'd seen things no young man should see. Took him years to talk about it, years to feel like himself again. And when he finally did, you know what he told me? He said he didn't fight so that people back home could be afraid. He said he fought so they could be free." He paused, and his voice dropped even lower. "He died last spring. Heart gave out, but I think he would have liked what you said tonight." He nodded again and walked away, his cane tapping into the darkness. I drove home alone that night. The streets were empty, the city quiet. The radio played something soft, a song I did not recognize, and I turned it off after a few minutes. I needed the silence. I needed to hear my own thoughts without distraction. The faces from that room stayed with me as I drove. The older veteran with his careful medals, the woman with tears on her cheeks, the children who would grow up never knowing what their fathers had endured, what their mothers had sacrificed. These were the people I had spoken to tonight, not the politicians or the investigators or the men who made lists. Just ordinary Americans trying to live their lives with some measure of dignity. I did not know what would happen next. I did not know if there would be consequences, if my name would appear in some column tomorrow, if the careful machinery of suspicion would turn its attention toward me with renewed interest. These were not idle concerns. Men with far less public profiles than mine had seen their careers destroyed for saying far less than I had said tonight. But I knew something else, something that settled into my chest like a stone. There are moments when a person has to choose between safety and integrity, between silence and truth, between the easy path and the right one. Those moments come without warning, and they do not come twice. You either rise to meet them, or you spend the rest of your life wondering what might have been different if you had. I pulled into my driveway and turned off the engine. The house was dark. The night was quiet. Somewhere, a dog barked once and then fell silent. And somewhere out there, in rooms I would never see, Men and women were making their own choices about what kind of country this would be. Some of them would choose fear. Some of them would choose courage. Most of them would never know the difference until it was too late. But that night, in that room full of veterans and their families, I had said what I believed. And that, I decided, would have to be enough.